History isn't always noble scrolls and golden crowns. Sometimes it's teeth pulled with rocks, beer floods gone wrong, and forests of corpses. The like button survived history's worst disasters. Barely tap it before it ends up in a museum. Chapter 1, Ancient Dentistry was brutal. Imagine a dusty village 9,000 years ago, somewhere on the ancient plains of what is now Pakistan. The sun is blistering. The wind carries the dry scent of earth and livestock, and under the crude shade of a thatched hut, a man leans back while another hunches over him with a sharpened shard of flint. There is no soothing hum of a machine, no sterile gleam of metal tools, no gentle utterances whispered in a clean, air-conditioned room. Instead, there is the scraping of stone against enamel, the thick tension of hands pinning the patient's head still, and the sharp, uncontrollable screams of a man who knows the only way out is through the oldest known dental work unearthed. From a Neolithic graveyard in measure shows teeth that were deliberately and skillfully drilled. These were not accidental chips or marks left by scavengers. No, these holes were precise, centered squarely in the biting surfaces of mirrors crafted with a clear, grim intent. Archaeologists studying these finds realized they were looking at evidence of dental treatment so ancient it rewrote the history of medicine itself. Using flint-tipped drills spun with a simple bow and string mechanism, early dentists carved into decayed teeth in an attempt to remove rot and relieve pain. There was no anesthetic to numb the nerves. Every grinding twist of stone would have sent bolts of agony flashing through the jaw, the eyes, the skull. The flint drill was an unforgiving tool, razor sharp but brittle, capable of tearing through enamel the hardest substance in the human body, yet prone to snapping if mishandled. The bow drill itself was simple, the kind a carpenter might recognize. A wooden bow strung with animal sinew was looped around a short, straight shaft tipped with flint. By moving the bow back and forth, the shaft spun rapidly, the flint head biting into the tooth like a crude but determined worm. One wrong move, one slip, and the patient could be left with a cracked molar or worse. A shattered jaw, still in their primitive way, these early healers displayed astonishing skill. Some teeth show signs that the drill reached into deep cavities without puncturing the tooth's inner chamber, the pulp where nerves and blood vessels coiled. To drill so deeply and yet stop short of mortal agony required both a delicate hand and an intimate, if unscientific, understanding of human anatomy. It is chilling to imagine the practice sessions that might have led to this level of expertise. Did they begin with animal teeth, scraping and drilling the murs of goats or pigs until their control was preciso? Or did they learn by doing each human patient? A desperate gamble in a war against decayed tooth decay in the Neolithic period was a slow but inevitable predator. Early agriculture meant a diet rich in grains, and well, these filled bellies, they also bathed teeth in sugars and starches. Perfect fuel for the bacteria that gnawed away at enamel and gum. Without modern oral hygiene, plaque would have built up, quickly hardening into tartar, seeping into the roots of teeth and sparking infections that fed for months or even years. The stench of rotting teeth would have been a familiar, unwelcome companion in every gathering. Pain was not just an inconvenience. Infections stemming from dental problems could be fatal, spreading from the mouth into the bloodstream and seeding deadly illnesses throughout the body. To submit oneself to the terrifying ordeal of Neolithic dentistry might have been the only hope of survival. In this light, the brutal drill was not a weapon of cruelty, but a desperate lifeline, a way to cling just a little longer to existence. The practice of ancient dentistry was not isolated to Megar. Evidence from other corners of the ancient world paints a similar harrowing picture in ancient Egypt papyrus scrolls, like the famed Ebas papyrus. One of the oldest surviving medical texts mention treatments for toothworms, a common but misguided belief that invisible parasites burrowed into teeth and caused decay. Egyptian healers prescribed various picuses and spells, mixing superstition with practical care. Some skulls from ancient Egypt show teeth bound with gold wire, primitive braces that hinted attempts not just to treat decay, but to correct crooked smiles. The ancient Chinese approached dental care with their own blend of ingenuity and tradition. Early texts describe the use of acupuncture to relieve toothache, targeting pressure points thought to be connected to dental pain. Some records even mention the crafting of rudimentary dental prosthetics, where carved bamboo pegs were fitted into the mouths of the toothless. Meanwhile, in ancient Rome, dentists known as dentary plied their trade on bustling street corners. They pulled teeth with iron forceps, the crude predecessors of today's sleek dental instruments. If a Roman citizen suffered from severe decay, the solution was often extraction, swift, brutal, and final. Wealthier Romans might visit a more reputable dentist who would numb the area with a compress soaked in a mixture of herbs and wine, but for most it was raw and immediate. The crack of bone, the gush of blood, the empty space where a mare once anchored compared to the grim theater of ancient dentistry. The polished world of modern dental care feels almost like science fiction. Today, dentists wield precision drills, microscopic cameras, and lasers. Anesthesia, from local injections to full sedation, ensures that the patient's worst experience is often boredom rather than pain. Cavities are spotted early with X-rays cleaned with sonic scalers and filled with composite resins that blend invisibly into natural teeth. The very idea of willingly returning to the agonies of a Neolithic dental procedure is unthinkable, and yet it was a part of ordinary life for thousands of years. The archaeological record offers haunting glimpses into the minds of those ancient patients. Some teeth bear multiple drill marks suggesting that the first attempt failed or that decay returned after treatment. Others show signs of wear around the drilled area, indicating that patients survived the ordeal and continued to use their repaired teeth for years. This was not always a death sentence. For some, the crude drilling bought time, a few more seasons of chewing, speaking, living. Pain, of course, was not the only ordeal. Infection after such procedures would have been a constant risk. Without antibiotics, even a minor complication could swell into a raging abscess, the flesh of the face ballooning grotesquely until it ruptured or killed. Ancient healers turned to the few weapons they had: herbal compresses, honey, known even then for its antibacterial properties, and prayers to unseen gods. There is a visceral intimacy to this ancient craft. To perform dentistry without the barrier of gloves, masks, or antiseptic meant getting close, feeling the heat of another's breath, the tension of their muscles, the way their sweat mingled with yours. It meant hearing every ragged scream, every gasping breath, every whispered plea. Dentistry was not a sterile science. It was a shared brutality, a test of endurance for both patient and healer. And yet, despite all the horrors, there was a kind of resilience encoded in these ancient teeth. The very existence of treated murs from 9,000 years ago is a testament to human stubbornness, to the primal instinct to fight decay, to cling to life and function even when pain roared through the body like wildfire. It shows us that medicine, even in its rawest, bloodiest form, is as old as civilization itself. The story of ancient dentistry is not just a story of suffering. It is a story of innovation, adaptation, and relentless hope. In the flickering firelight of those Neolithic villages, as the flint drill whirred and the patient gritted his teeth against an agony that would have felled a lesser soul, humanity took one more unsteady step towards the mastery of its own frail, stubborn body. Thousands of years later, as we sit comfortably in reclining chairs under soft lights, listening to the muted whir of electric drills, it's easy to forget how deep our roots run. Every smile, every painless filling, every polished tooth is an echo of faint but persistent memory of a time when healing meant pain, when survival demanded courage, and when the only anesthesia was the strength of the human spirit. Chapter 2: Bodies Snatching for Medical Schools. In the cold, damp nights of 18th and 19th century, Europe, a peculiar and grisly trade flourished under the cloak of darkness. Medical schools, bursting with eager students and desperate for hands-on anatomical instruction, found themselves confronted by a chilling dilemma. The law allowed only the corpses of executed criminals to be used for dissection, yet the number of executions had dwindled while the number of students had surged. The solution was grimly practical. If bodies could not be obtained legally, they would be obtained by other means. Thus emerged the resurrectionists, professional body snatchers who stalked graveyards in the dead of night seeking the newly buried. It was a business built on speed, discretion, and a macabre expertise. Fresh graves were ideal. The earth was soft, the corpse still pliable, and decay had yet to erase the features. Valuable to anatomical study, the tools of the trade were simple. Wooden spades for silent digging, long iron hooks for hauling the body from its resting place, and heavy sacks to carry their grim cargo through the misty streets. Time was their greatest enemy. They worked quickly, often excavating only the head end of the grave to save precious minutes. A wooden board might be placed on the ground beside the grave to catch the soil and prevent telltale signs of disturbance. Once the coffin was reached, it was common to break it open at the head, hook the corpse under the arms, and drag it out without lifting the lid, fully in the bustling cities of London, Edinburgh, and New York. The trade grew into a quiet, sinister industry. Medical colleges, their walls packed with students hungry to peel back the mysteries of the human body, became the willing customers of this gruesome market. Deals were struck in shadowed alleyways or through whispers passed over a tavern counter. Surgeons and anatomists paid handsomely, often turning a blind eye to the true origins of the cadavers delivered to their doors. Graveyards became battlegrounds. Families, terrified that their loved ones would be stolen from the earth, devised all manner of defenses. Some installed heavy iron mort safes over graves' cages designed to prevent disturbance. Others hired watchmen to guard cemeteries at night, armed with pistols and lanterns. In especially desperate cases, mourning families would take turns, standing vigil over a fresh grave, keeping watch until decomposition made the body worthless to medical schools. Yet the resurrectionists adapted. They timed their raids carefully, often striking in the first days after a burial, when vigilance waned. They might bribe gravediggers or local constables to look the other way. In cities like Edinburgh, where the demand was particularly fierce, gangs of body snatchers formed, working in shifts and sharing profits. Among the most infamous figures to emerge from this dark economy were William Burke and William Hare. Their story so sordid that it would chill the blood of an entire nation unfolded in the cramped, faded tenements of Edinburgh in the late 1820s. Unlike the traditional resurrectionists Burke and Hare did not bother with graveyards, finding grave robbing too slow and too risky, they turned to a more direct method: murder. They targeted society's most vulnerable, the poor, the homeless, the unmissed, luring victims into Hare's boarding house with promises of drink or shelter. They dispatched them by suffocation, a method that left few marks on the body and maximized the cadaver's value for dissection. The corpses were then sold to the celebrated anatomist Dr. Robert Knox, who asked few questions. Burke and Hare's spree continued until suspicion caught up with them. Their trial and the sensational public outrage that followed laid bare the moral rot that had crept into the world of medical education. Burke was hanged for his crimes, and in a grim twist of poetic justice, his body was publicly dissected, a final exhibition of the trade he had so ruthlessly fed. But even before the horrors of Burke and Hare came to light, the fear of body snatchers had gripped society. Newspapers spread lurid tales of exhumed corpses and desecrated graves. In cities like London, the clatter of night watchmen's rattles echoed through the narrow streets, and wealthy families paid to have graves lined with stone or encased in steel. Coffins, the anatomy schools, while officially condemning the illegal trade, often participated through a kind of willful ignorance. Some professors left payment in unlocked rooms, never asking how a corpse appeared on the dissection table students desperate to learn kept. Their questioned silent knowledge, they reasoned, demanded. Sacrifice, even if it was someone else's. The public's horror reached a peak in the early 19th century with cases like the London Burkhards, imitators of Birkin, here who attempted to murder vagrants for sale to surgeons. Although less successful and ultimately caught, they stoked the growing outcry against the body trade. In response, legislation slowly ground into motion. The Anatomy Act of 1832 in Britain changed everything. It allowed medical schools legal access to the bodies of the unclaimed dead, the impoverished, the institutionalized, those who died in workhouses without family to claim them. The act effectively ended the resurrectionist era, but not without staining the medical profession with decades of uneasy music. Compromised life for a resurrectionist was a strange and perilous existence. They operated in shifting alliances, sometimes partnering with rival gangs, sometimes betrayed for a higher price. They risked arrest, beatings, and the ever-present danger of violent mobs if caught in the act. Yet for many, it was a lucrative business. A single cadaver could fetch a sum equivalent to several months' honest wages, night after night. They would stalk the graveyards, waiting for the moon to slip behind clouds, ears straining for the crunch of approaching boots. They carried no lanterns, trusting their fingers and instincts to do their grim work. The scent of disturbed earth, the groan of shifting coffins, the rush of panic. When the coffin lid cracked open, these were the constant companions of their trade. Tools evolved alongside their methods. Some favored collapsing shovels that folded for easier concealment. Others used slender corpse hooks forged especially to snag bodies without leaving obvious signs of tampering. Disguises were common, passing as mourners during the day to scout fresh burials or posing as night watchmen to deflect suspicion. In smaller towns, resurrectionists had to be especially cunning. Communities were tight-knit, and a single unfamiliar face could trigger suspicion. Sometimes they recruited locals' gravediggers who, for the price of a few coins, would leave a grave loose and easy to breach. The profits lured all manner of men into the trade. Some were failed artisans, others discharged soldiers or desperate laborers. A few became wealthy enough to retire, comfortably living out their days far from the graves they had once defiled. Meanwhile, the terror of body snatching seeped into popular culture. Pamphlets, ballads, and plays turned the resurrectionist into a ghastly boogeyman. Children were warned not to wander near cemeteries after dark. Tales of spectral figures carrying sacks over their shoulders fed the era's appetite for ghost stories and moral panic. Despite the end of large-scale body snatching after the Anatomy Act, isolated incidents continued for decades. In parts of rural America where laws lagged behind and medical schools still struggled for cadavers, body snatchers operated well into the late 19th century. Some American universities even maintained resurrection crews on unofficial payrolls, discreetly replenishing their stocks as needed. In truth, the entire grim chapter was born from a collision of necessity and taboo. The human body was sacred in the eyes of society. To violate it was an unthinkable horror. But without cadavers, the practice of medicine stagnated. Every surgeon who saved lives, every physician who understood the mysteries of disease and anatomy owed something, however, uncomfortably to the long bloody legacy of the body snatchers. Today, when medical students unwrap a cadaver for study, it is with consent forms and legal protections in sterile, brightly lit labs. But not so long ago, that education was bought at the price of fear, desecration, and the restless dead. In the cold, wet graveyards of a bygone world, knowledge had a cost, and there were always those willing to pay. At Chapter 3, the Molasses Flood, 1919, on a crisp January afternoon in 1919, the North End of Boston buzzed with the ordinary sounds of a working city. Children played in the cobblestone streets, horses passed hauling delivery carts, and dock workers moved between warehouses along the waterfront. The air was unusually sweet, a thick cloying scent that had long been familiar to the residents. Towering above Commercial Street stood a massive steel tank, 50 feet high and 90 feet across, filled to the brim, with over 2 million gallons of molasses. At 12:40 p.m., without warning, the world shifted. A sharp rumble split the air, louder than any passing train. Eyewitnesses later said it was like the roar of an explosion followed by a deep bone-rattling groan. The tank, never properly engineered, riddled with leaks, hastily patched with paint, had given way. Its rivets, overstrained and poorly fitted, tore free with the sound of machine gun fire. The side of the tank peeled outward like the skin of a bursting fruit, releasing a monstrous dark wave. The molasses hit the street at 35 miles per hour, faster than a man could run carrying. With it, a force almost impossible to comprehend. It wasn't water. It was heavier, thicker, a slow moving, fast-killing tide. The wave stood an estimated 25 feet high at its peak, a bulging wall of brown syrup that swallowed everything in its path. Buildings buckled before it. Heavy molasses sheared steel girders from a nearby elevated train line, sending a section crashing to the ground with a shriek of twisting metal. Houses were ripped from their foundations, timber frames splintered like matchsticks. Horses pulling wagons vanished under the surge, their screams muffled into the suffocating sweetness. People, office workers, children, sailors were caught mid-step, unable to outrun or even react before the flood engulfed them. Witnesses spoke of the molasses' terrifying power. A grown man, if he wasn't swept off his feet outright, would find his legs entangled by the heavy syrup. Each frantic movement only sank him deeper until breathing became a struggle against a suffocating, sticky death. One child was seen lifted into the air, pinned against a telegraph pole by the force of the wave, and left there dangling as the flood passed beneath. The first responders, police, firefighters, sailors from the nearby navyyard waded into chaos. They fought not only to rescue the trapped, but also to move it all. Each step demanded immense effort. The molasses gripped boots and limbs like wet cement. Men found themselves immobilized, exhausted within minutes, sinking into a nightmare that smelled of sugar but clung like death. Panic gave way to grim determination. Ropes were thrown to those stuck fast. Ladders were propped against wreckage to haul survivors from trial ledge. Choked basement rescuers soon learned that pulling too hard could tear the skin from a trapped person's body. They worked carefully, meticulously, while time slipped away for those buried. Deeper in the goo, the cries of the injured mixed with the low groans of collapsing structures. Somewhere in the distance, the bells of fire engines clanged madly as more men rushed toward the scene, their horses already gasping and floundering in the mess. Along the waterfront, molasses oozed into the harbor, painting the water a sickly brown. The tank had belonged to the Purity Distilling Company, a subsidiary of United States Industrial Alcohol. The molasses was destined to be fermented into industrial alcohol, a lucrative business, especially with the looming threat of prohibition. In the rush to meet demand, safety had been sacrificed. The tank had leaked from the start, groaning ominously. On warm days, residents had complained even children had smeared molasses leaking from its seams onto pieces of scrap metal for a treat. Management's response had been to repaint the tank a darker color, making the leaks harder to see. Now all of Boston could see the consequences. In the hours that followed, a makeshift morgue was established at Commercial Street. Bodies, when found, were almost unrecognizable, coated in syrup, bloated by pressure, sometimes dismembered by the sheer force of the wave. Of the 21 lives lost, some were crushed against walls, others smothered where they fell. One man, a firehouse worker, was found days later, trapped under a collapsed section of his station, so tightly glued in molasses that chisels were needed to free him. The injured numbered around 150, many suffering from broken limbs, concussions, and deep lacerations. Doctors struggled to clean wounds clogged with sticky, bacteria-laden molasses. Infection spread rapidly, hospitals overflowed, and for days afterward, North End residents reported a clawing scent. of sweetness mixed with rot hanging heavy in the air. Cleanup was a Herculean effort. Molasses seeped into every crevice between cobblestones, under door frames, into basement. It clung to clothing, hair, and skin, horseshoes. Slurped against the streets for weeks. Fire crews turned to salt water from the harbor and sand to try and scrub the molasses away, but the task seemed endless. Workers wore out mops, brooms, and boots. The city, desperate to return to normal, found itself battling a viscous enemy that refused to let go. The molasses didn't confine itself to the immediate disaster zone. Cleanup workers, firefighters, and rescuers tracked it on their boots, their clothes, their very breath, carrying it through the streets, into homes, onto public transport. Entire sections of Boston remained sticky for months. Some residents would later claim that even decades on the hottest summer days, the air still carried a faint, sickly, sweet scent. Investigations began almost immediately. Public outrage demanded answers. Courtrooms filled with technical diagrams of the failed tank engineers, pointing out fatal flaws in its design. Experts testified that the steel was too thin, the rivets insufficient, and that the tank had never been properly tested before being filled to capacity. Testimony revealed that leaks had been so frequent that neighborhood children had joked about molasses rain. The Purity Distilling Company, under intense scrutiny, claimed that anarchists had bombed the tank. It was a feeble defense. Evidence overwhelmingly pointed to negligence. After years of legal battles, one of the first major class action lawsuits in American history, United States Industrial Alcohol, was found liable and ordered to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in damages, the equivalent of millions today. Yet no fine or settlement could undo the losses suffered that day. Families had been shattered. The North End community, already struggling with poverty and overcrowding, bore the scars, both physical and emotional. In the years that followed, safety standards for construction were tightened. Engineers and architects began requiring more rigorous testing and inspection for large structures. The disaster horrific, though, it was forced changes that would protect countless lives in the decades to come. Today, few physical traces remain. A small plaque near the site quietly commemorates the victims of the Great Molasses Flood. Tourists walk Commercial Street, unaware that the ground they tread was once the scene of one of America's strangest and deadliest industrial disasters. But for those who know, the story lingers, as sticky, as inescapable as the flood itself. The day the tank burst, Boston learned that even something as innocuous as molasses could turn deadly, that human negligence could turn sweetness into suffocation, and that even in the heart of a bustling city, disaster could come with a slow, relentless surge rather than a sudden blast. And in the memories of those who survived and those who lost everything, the world would never smell quite so sweet. It was not just a treatment, it was the treatment. No matter the ailment, fever, headache, cough, infection, the solution often involved a blade of vein and the slow draining of life itself. The practice found its roots in ancient theories, particularly the doctrine of the four humors, an idea that gripped Western medicine for nearly 2,000 years. According to this belief, the human body was governed by four vital fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health was a matter of perfect balance. Illness, therefore, meant imbalance. And if blood was believed to be in excess, as it so often was according to the learned doctors of the day, then the answer was clear: remove it. The methods were straightforward but brutal. Physicians or barber surgeons would first select a vein, often in the forearm or neck, sometimes using charts that mapped out which veins corresponded to specific ailments. They would then use a lancet, a small sharp knife, to pierce the vein, guiding the flow of blood into a waiting vessel. Sometimes the procedure was controlled, measured out by volume. Other times it was a matter of intuition, drawing blood until the patient looked sufficiently pale, sufficiently relieved of their burden. For those unable to withstand the knife, or for more delicate procedures, leeches were called upon. The slimy creatures applied to the skin would latch on and draw blood at a slow, methodical pace. apothecary kept jars of them wriggling and squirming, ready to be dispatched to households at the first sign of fever. The settings varied widely. Bloodletting could take place in a bustling hospital ward, among rows of moaning patients in the privacy of a nobleman's bedchamber, with velvet drapes and silver basins, or on a dirt floor by candlelight in a poor man's shack, regardless of the surroundings. The ritual was the same, the belief in purification through the letting of blood, the idea that sickness could be coaxed from the body, one crimson drop at a time. It was into this world in December of 1799 that George Washington fell ill. America's first president, revered general, and elder statesman, had retired to his beloved Mount Vernon. After a cold ride inspecting his estate, he returned home soaked and chilled. By nightfall, he developed a sore throat, a hoarseness that worsened into a severe difficulty breathing. His doctors, three of them prominent men of their day, were summoned in haste. Their response was immediate and predictable bloodletting over the course of roughly 12 hours. Washington was bled 4 times, each session removing between half a pint to a full pint of blood. In total, nearly 5 pints were taken, almost 40% of his body's blood volume. Washington, ever the stoic soldier, bore it without complaint, but with each letting his condition deteriorated, his breathing grew more labored, his skin cold and clammy. In an era before oxygen therapy, before antibiotics, before understanding the body's desperate need for its circulating blood, the doctors believed they were fighting for his life. In truth, they were draining it away. By 10 o'clock that night, George Washington was dead. Historians have long debated the exact cause: a severe throat infection, likely epiglottitis, or acute bacterial laryngitis, but there is little doubt that the massive blood loss hastened his end. His death became one of the most famous and tragic examples of bloodletting's dangers. Yet even then few questioned the practice. Bloodletting was too deeply entrenched. Medical texts praised its virtues. Professors taught it to eager students. Patients demanded it, believing in its purgative power. Other prominent figures heard. Washington's fate, Charles II of England, after suffering a seizure, endured a frenzy of bloodletting, purging, and cupping that drained him of strength until he succumbed. In Revolutionary France, the surgeon Antoine Dubois bled women during childbirth to ease the process, a treatment that often resulted in hemorrhage and death. Across Europe and America, the bleeding bowl became as essential a symbol of medicine as the stethoscope is today. The logic, twisted though it seems now, was understandable within its context. Without knowledge of bacteria, viruses, or the body's complex circulatory needs, physicians grasped for visible, measurable interventions. Bloodletting provided action, and action offered hope. It gave both doctor and patient the sense that something tangible was being done, even if the results were often disastrous. Methods grew elaborate. Some doctors practiced heroic medicine, an aggressive approach that favored extreme bloodletting combined with blistering and purging. Patients would be bled until they fainted, revived with spirits of ammonia, and bled again. Others prescribed derivation, drawing blood from one part of the body to relieve symptoms in another based on theories of redirected energies. Instruments evolved. 2 spring-loaded lancets allowed for rapid vein puncture. Scarificators, intricate brass devices with multiple blades, could release a dozen parallel cuts at once. Cupping glasses heated to create suction were applied to the skin after shallow incisions, encouraging a slow ooze of blood, thought to draw out poisons lurking beneath the flesh. Yet cracks in the practice began to show. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, critical voices emerged. French physician Pierre Charles Alexandre Louis conducted statistical studies, comparing outcomes in bloodlet and non-bloodlet patients. His data suggested that bloodletting offered little benefit and often worsened outcomes. It was one of the earliest examples of evidence-based medicine creeping into a tradition-bound field. Gradually, as scientific understanding deepened, medicine began to abandon bloodletting. The discovery of microbes, The development of vaccines, the rise of antiseptic technique, all undermine the old. Ideas of humoral imbalance by the late 19th century, bloodletting had been relegated to a handful of rare specific conditions. No longer the universal remedy it once was. The final death nails were sounded by progress too loud to ignore. Joseph Lister's promotion of germ theory, Louis Pasteur's discoveries and advances in physiology revealed the blood's critical role in carrying oxygen, nutrients, and immune cells. To lose it casually was no longer seen as therapeutic, but reckless. Still, vestiges of the old ways persisted. Leeches, for instance, found a second life in microsurgery, used to relieve venous congestion, and reattached fingers and ears. Controlled bloodletting or phlebotomy remained, and remains a valid treatment for certain rare conditions, like polyphamia vera and hemochromatosis, but these are precise scientific applications of far cry from the wholesale trainings of centuries past. The story of bloodletting is a cautionary tale woven through the fabric of medical history. It reminds us that science is not static, that today's certainties may become tomorrow's curiosities. It shows how deeply tradition, culture, and the desperate need to act combined even the most intelligent minds to flawed practices. Imagine it now, a crowded room, thick with the scent of sweat and candle smoke, a doctor poised with his lancet, a basin gleaming dully at his side. The patient's arm extends tremulously, a prayer whispered to whatever God might hear. A quick slice, a flow of red, a moment's hope that the poison is pouring out. And perhaps for a fleeting instant, both doctor and patient believe it. It is easy to judge them from the vantage of modern knowledge. Harder, but more important, is to understand the desperation and earnestness that drove them. They bled their patients not out of malice, but from a fervent belief that they were saving them. That belief, misguided though it was, carried the practice across continents, across generations. Today, the bloodletting bowls sit in museums, their polished surfaces catching the light like relics from a darker time. They whisper of a world where healing meant harm, where understanding had not yet caught up to compassion, and where the lifeblood of countless patients was trusted to run out in the name of health. The story ends not with outrage, but with progress. Slowly, painfully, the world moved forward, guided by new discoveries, new methods, and the relentless drive to do better. Medicine, like all human endeavor, learned from its mistakes, sometimes at a terrible cost. The blood that once flowed so freely from trembling veins was not in vain. It paved the way for a new era of understanding, where the body was no longer a battleground of mysterious humors, but a complex, wondrous system deserving of knowledge, care, and above all, respect. Chapter 5. The Mad Gasser of Mattoon. In the late summer of 1944, as World War II raged across Europe and the Pacific, the town of Mattoon, Illinois, seemed a world apart. A modest community of around 15,000, its streets were lined with meat houses and trimmed lawns. Neighbors greeted each other by name. Children rode bicycles past corner stores where flags hung heavy in the warm air. There was an undercurrent of tension, rationing telegrams bearing grim news from overseas, but Mattoon had thus far been untouched by the violence shaping the globe. That changed on the night of August 31st. It began quietly. A woman named Mrs. Kearney was at home with her daughter when a strange, sickly sweet odor seeped into the room. Within minutes, Mrs. Kearney felt her throat tightened and her legs grow numb. Panic set in as she struggled to move. She cried out for help, and her sister, visiting from next door, came running. They reported seeing a figure fleeing into the darkness. The police investigated, but found nothing. Still, the story spread quickly. By the next night, more reports came in. A man returning home late noticed a strange shadow lingering near his porch. Moments later, his wife collapsed, complaining of nausea and paralysis. Another woman awoke to find herself unable to breathe, her room filled with an acrid, chemical scent. Fear gripped Mattoon like a clenched fist. Homes that had never locked their doors now barred them at night. Fathers kept baseball bats by their beds. Mothers tucked their children in with the windows nailed shut despite the suffocating summer heat. People spoke of the anesthetic prowler, later dubbed by newspapers as the mad gasser of Mattoon reports, multiplied victims. Described a thin, sickly odor sometimes compared to gardenia, sometimes to sweet acetone. Symptoms varied: dizziness, nausea, temporary paralysis of the legs, burning sensations in the mouth and throat. Some found oily stains on their window screens. Others spotted footprints in the dirt. Outside, the layout of Mattoon, with its modest grid of streets and closely packed houses, made it easy for fear to spread. Word of mouth traveled faster than the evening edition of the local paper. Every creak of a floorboard, every whisper of wind against a window pane became evidence of the mad gases. Return police patrols doubled. Officers combed alleys and backyards by flashlight, but they found no attacker. No fingerprints, no discarded equipment, no physical traces beyond those murky stains and trampled flower beds. The newspapers fanned the flames, printing breathless headlines about the latest attack, quoting frightened residents who are sure they had seen a shadowy figure melting into the night. Theories sprouted like weeds. Some believed it was a mad scientist, releasing experimental chemicals through open windows. Others whispered of German saboteurs infiltrating the home front to sow terror. Still others claimed it was a lone lunatic, someone unhinged by wartime stress. There were skeptics too. Some local doctors began to suggest that many of the symptoms might have been psychosomatic, the product of suggestion, stress, and fear, rather than an actual chemical agent. Wartime America was a fertile ground for anxiety. Families lived in a state of constant dread, awaiting news from the front, rationing food and fuel, grappling with blackouts and air raid drills. In such an atmosphere, it was not hard to imagine fear taking physical form, but there were curious details that defied easy dismissal. One report described a woman who was overcome so quickly that she collapsed within seconds of smelling the strange odor. Another involved a couple who, upon sensing the gas, fled their home only to find themselves disoriented and stumbling as if drunk. Some claimed to see a figure armed with a small device, something like a spray gun, though descriptions varied wildly. The authorities, pressured to act, offered little comfort. They suggested it might be industrial pollution from a nearby factory, though no specific source was ever identified. They questioned whether pranksters might be at work, possibly armed with amateur chemistry sets. Yet, even as officials urged calm, the number of reported incidents soared. By early September, the panic reached its zenith. Residents banded together to form neighborhood watches. Reports came in of armed groups patrolling the streets, ready to confront any suspicious figure. More than once, innocent strangers were accosted by jittery citizens with shotguns and baseball bats. Yet, just as swiftly as it had erupted, the wave of terror began to ebb. No perpetrator was ever caught. No definitive evidence was uncovered. The mad gases seemed to evaporate, leaving behind only confusion and unease. The local police eventually declared the case closed, attributing most incidents to hysteria, possibly fueled by the highly stressful wartime environment and sensational newspaper reporting. In the years that followed, psychologists cited the Mad Gata phenomenon as a textbook case of mass hysteria, a community-wide episode where fear, stress, and rumor created a shared delusion. Others remained unconvinced, pointing to the consistency of physical symptoms and the number of credible witnesses. Today, Mattoon remembers the mad gasser with a strange blend of embarrassment and fascination. Some residents dismiss the whole episode as a bout of collective nerves. Others maintain that something or someone really prowled the streets that summer, armed with a weapon no one ever conclusively identified. What is certain is that for a few tense weeks in 1944, Mattoon lived a waking nightmare. The mad gas's legacy is a chilling reminder of how fear can stalk even the safest streets. How quickly a familiar world can twist into something unrecognizable under the right conditions. Whether phantom, criminal, or figment, the mad gasser left a permanent shadow over a small Midwestern town that had until then thought itself safe from the chaos of a world at war. Chapter 6, Coffin Births. In the medieval world, death was a constant presence. It stalked the streets with plague, famine, and war, filling churchyards and crypts with a steady tide of the departed. Death was not a distant, sanitized event. It was intimate, witnessed in living rooms, on battlefields, and in the dim halls of monasteries. Yet even within this grim familiarity, some occurrences startled even the most hardened souls. One of the most unsettling and least understood was the phenomenon known as coffin birth. The name is clinical, but the reality it describes is stark. When a pregnant woman died, the biological forces unleashed by decomposition sometimes triggered an eerie and tragic event as the body decayed. Gases produced by bacterial activity swelled the abdomen. In rare cases, the pressure grew so great that it forced the unborn fetus from the womb, pushing it through the birth canal. Thus, after death, a mother could seem to give birth in her grave. In the medieval mind, with its limited understanding of anatomy and no concept of bacterial decay, such an event must have seemed like something beyond nature. Medicine at the time was rudimentary at best. Physicians still clung to the ancient theories of humors, balancing treatments between bleeding, purging, and prayer. Knowledge of the body's internal workings was based more on classical texts than direct observation. Autopsies were rare and often frowned upon by religious authorities. In this landscape of half-truths and mystery, a coffin birth would have been an almost incomprehensible sight. Imagine the scene: a shallow grave dug hastily in consecrated ground. Body of a woman, perhaps wrapped in a simple shroud, lowered into the earth with solemn prayers. Weeks later, as the soil shifted, whether through natural erosion, animal disturbance, or the hand of a gravedigger, the grave was disturbed. Inside, the grim spectacle revealed itself. The fetal form, small and pale, partially emerged from the mother's body, still tethered by the umbilical cord, encased in the darkness of the tomb. Such discoveries would have sent shock waves through small, tightly knit communities. Midwives, often among the few with any real experience of childbirth, might be called to interpret what had happened. Priests seeking answers within the framework of sin and divine judgment might see it as a sign, a warning, a punishment, or a miracle, depending on the circumstances. To the common folk steeped in a culture of superstition and religious awe, it could easily be seen as an ill omen, a ghostly protest from the other side of death. Historical cases, though rare, have been uncovered. Archaeological excavations in places like Imola, Italy, have revealed burials where a fetus lies between or beneath the skeletal remains of a woman, suggesting a coffin birth. One such grave, dating to the 7th or 8th century, showed clear signs: the fetal bones arranged in a position consistent with a post-mortem expulsion rather than a live birth. The mother had been buried face up. The child pushed from her loins in the silent, unseen hours after interment. Death and childbirth were tightly interwoven in medieval society. Maternal mortality was brutally common. Childbirth was a perilous journey, often accompanied by rituals designed to guard both mother and child against the many dangers that lurked unseen. Midwives carried charms and prayers, applying ointments and potions rooted as much in folklore as in any empirical understanding. If a woman died during labor, it was a tragedy, but if her body, weeks later, appeared to have given birth in death, it was a rapture in the natural order, something that demanded explanation without the tools of modern science. Medieval people filled the gaps in understanding with belief. Some might have seen a coffin birth as the mother's spirit trying to save her child from beyond the grave. Others might have interpreted it as evidence of witchcraft or divine punishment. The fetus, expelled but lifeless, could be viewed as a cursed soul, a child born wrong, outside the blessing of baptism. The church, ever concerned with the fate of souls, had strict doctrines about baptism and salvation. A child born after the mother's death, especially if discovered too late for baptism, presented a theological dilemma. Could such a soul be saved, or was it doomed by the cruel accident of timing debates? Among scholars and priests wrestled with these questions, but answers remain murky. Meanwhile, burial practices themselves often exacerbated the mystery. Bodies were usually interred quickly to prevent disease. Sometimes within a day of death, shrouds were common, but coffins when used were simple and unsealed. In warmer months, decomposition began swiftly. Without refrigeration or embalming, the gases of putrefaction could swell a body grotesquely within hours, creating the very conditions that led to a coffin birth. Yet such events were exceedingly rare. Modern forensic studies have shown that true coffin births require a precise set of conditions: the right stage of pregnancy, the right rate of decomposition, a body buried in a way that allowed pressure to build rather than dissipate. Still, in a world where death was always near, even rare horrors had outsized effects on the imagination. Accounts from the early modern period hint at how lingering beliefs about coffin births bled into cultural fears. In some regions, it was said that pregnant women should be buried deeper, or differently, to prevent unnatural births. Grave markers sometimes included cryptic symbols that might, according to local law, ward off restless spirits associated with such deaths. Over time, as medical knowledge advanced the true nature of coffin births came into focus, anatomists studying decomposition recognized the role of gas buildup and bodily pressure. What at once seemed supernatural was revealed to be a grim but natural consequence of deaths. Inexorable processes, yet even with understanding, the image remained haunting, a final tragic echo of a life unfinished. A mother and child bound together in death, their last movements dictated by the blind forces of decay. Today, coffin births are recognized in forensic pathology not as myths or miracles, but as rare biological events. They serve as reminders of how little control humans have in the face of mortality, and how closely life and death, hope and horror have always walked together. In the museums where medieval graves are studied and in the forensic reports that document these findings, the story of coffin births is preserved not as a ghastly curiosity, but as a solemn testament to the human experience. An experience shaped as much by mystery and fear as by the slow, steady light of knowledge. Chapter 7. The Abandoned Soviet Death Island Experiments. In the middle of the Aral Sea, once a sprawling inland ocean on the border of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, there was an island few had ever heard of. Vodena Rebirth Island in Russian was a place more barren than its name suggested. Flat, dry, and remote, it sat like a forgotten scrap of earth under the punishing Central Asian sun. Winds whipped over salt-streaked soil, the horizon blurred and endless. Mirage. It was this isolation that made Vozrodinia perfect for the work the Soviet Union intended. Beginning in the 1940s and accelerating through the Cold War, the island became one of the USSR's most secretive and dangerous facilities, a biological weapons testing ground. Under strict military control, Soviet scientists brought some of humanity's deadliest diseases to life, not to cure them, but to weaponize them. Anthrax, smallpox, plague, tularemia, and botulinum toxin were cultivated, studied, and dispersed. Animals, monkeys, guinea pigs, sheep were brought to the island and exposed to these agents to test the effectiveness and lethality of biological weapons under real-world conditions. Vozrodinia offered the perfect laboratory, its isolation surrounded by water and far from populated centers promised containment should anything escape. Its brutal environment discouraged casual visitors, and above all, it was hidden far from prying Western satellites buried behind layers of Soviet secrecy. The island evolved into a small, self-contained city for military personnel and scientists, housing complexes, laboratories, storage facilities, and testing zones spread across the sand. Roads stitched the barren landscape together. Huge tanks and sprayers were used to aerosolize deadly pathogens, allowing researchers to study how diseases might spread through the air, a horrifying prospect in an era where global conflict teetered on the brink of annihilation. Anthrax was a particular focus, Durable, resistant to environmental breakdown, and deadly Bacillus anthrae became the centerpiece of many experiments. Researchers created weaponized anthrax, designed not just to kill, but to survive, lingering in soil and air, ready to infect. Long after initial deployment, some experiments involved open-air releases over tethered animals. The researchers studying from a distance as the diseases did their grim work. Smallpox, already feared as one of history's deadliest scourges, was another sinister tool in the arsenal, despite a global push toward eradication. Soviet scientists preserved strains of variolavirus for military use, refining methods to spread it efficiently among civilian populations as the Cold War ground on the work on Vosrodinia continued in silence. Occasionally rumors would escape, whispers among defectors, odd blips in intelligence reports, but the full scope remained hidden. Then, in the early 1990s, the Soviet Union collapsed. It happened quickly. The vast machinery of Soviet power, built on decades of secrecy and fear, crumbled almost overnight. Military funding evaporated, communication broke down. Far-flung installations like Vosrodinya were suddenly without orders, without resupply, without purpose. The personnel abandoned the island, boarding transport ships and planes in a chaotic exodus. Laboratories were left unlocked, storage containers, some still filled with virulent agents, were abandoned to the elements. No final cleanup, no formal decontamination, just silence, and the slow, merciless return of the desert. As the years passed, Vosrostinia's isolation eroded too. The Aral Sea, once vast and sheltering, began to shrink, dramatically due to Soviet irrigation projects that diverted its feeding rivers. What had been an island became a peninsula, then part of the mainland. Now anyone with a sturdy vehicle and a willingness to brave the harsh terrain could drive straight onto the former Death Island. The dangers, however, remained very real. In the early 2000s, Western scientists and military officials, alarmed by the possibility of terrorists scavenging dangerous materials, organized limited cleanup missions. Teams ventured onto Vostenia to locate and neutralize caches of anthrax spores. What they found was chilling rusted drums of biological agents, shattered containment vessels, contaminated soil stretching for miles. The anthrax spores particularly had endured. Hardy and resistant, they lay dormant in the soil waiting. Simply disturbing the ground in the wrong place could release them into the air. The decontamination efforts were rushed, but incomplete. Thousands of square meters were treated with high concentrations of formaldehyde and other disinfectants, but the sheer scale of the contamination made full eradication nearly impossible. Today, Vosrodinia remains a scar in the landscape. The buildings are crumbling, their walls collapsed under decades of neglect. Laboratories that once teemed with life and deadly research stand hollow and silent. Testing fields are overgrown with scrub-hiding dangers invisible to the eye. Modern visitors, adventurers, scientists, occasional soldiers still tread carefully. There are no markers, no warning signs. The legacy of the Soviet bioweapons program lies just beneath the dust, a silent threat to the unwary. Animal carcasses occasionally found on the island suggest that pathogens, at least in some pockets, may still survive. Satellite images show eerie grids of abandoned roads and buildings half sunk in the sand, testaments to it. Dark chapter few have ever seen firsthand. Global security experts continue to worry in an age of rising concerns over bioterrorism. The thought that weaponized anthrax or plague might still lie scattered in forgotten bunkers is not an idle fear. Efforts to secure former Soviet bioweapon sites have been uneven, hampered by funding shortages, political instability, and the sheer remoteness of places like Vosrodinia. There are no known mass outbreaks linked directly to the island since its abandonment, but isolated incidents fuel concern in nearby regions. Occasional spikes in anthrax infections among livestock hint at the invisible legacy of decades-old experiments. Though impossible to directly trace back, they serve as grim reminders of how long-lasting and insidious biological contamination can be. Efforts to rehabilitate the Aral Sea to undo the environmental devastation caused by Soviet engineering have seen limited success, yet Vozrodinia remains untouched, an accidental monument to humanity's hubris. The idea that we can create and control forces we barely understand, then simply walk away when they spiral beyond our grasp. Standing amid the ruins, it is easy to imagine the island as it once was. Men in white suits moving briskly between sterile labs, the faint hum of generators under the roaring desert wind, the quiet terror of diseases cultivated not for cure but for conquest. Now all that remains is silence, a silence heavy with the weight of what was done and what was left behind. The story of Vozrodinia Island is not just a relic of the Cold War, it is a warning written in sand and bone about the dangers of secrecy, ambition, and abandonment. Some wounds once opened do not close easily. Some experiments once begun cannot simply be left to the dust out there in the empty heart of Central Asia. The legacy of Death Island endures patient, invisible, and unfinished. Chapter 8, Ötzi the Iceman's violent death. In the early autumn of 1991, high in the Ersteel Alps, along the shifting border between Austria and Italy, two hikers stumbled across something strange. Amid the rocks and melting ice, they saw what looked like a figure lying face down, half embedded in a glacial hollow. At first they thought it was a modern mountaineer who had fallen victim to the mountain's unforgiving weather. But as rescuers arrived and chipped carefully at the ice, they began to realize they were looking at something far older and far more mysterious. The body was astonishingly well preserved. Flesh still clung to bone. Fragments of clothing, woven grass, cloak leather, and hide clung stubbornly to the frozen form. Beside him lay a copper axe, a long bow, and a quiver filled with unfinished arrows. It was only after radiocarbon dating that the true enormity of the discovery became clear. This man had lived and died over 5,300 years ago during the Copper Age. He was soon nicknamed Sea after the valley where he was found. At first, researchers believed I had died of exposure, perhaps caught unprepared by a sudden alpine storm. Succumbing to the cold in the ancient silence of the high mountains, his body entombed in ice had been spared the ravages of time. Yet, as forensic techniques sharpened and investigations deepened, the story of Ötzi's final moments took a darker turn. A CT scan of his body revealed a small dark object lodged deep within his left shoulder, the stone arrowhead of a prehistoric weapon. Closer examination showed that the arrow had torn through a major artery under his collarbone. He would have bled out within minutes. He had not simply perished in a storm. He had been hunted, shot in the back, and left to die. Other injuries added new layers to the grim tableau. Bruises on his hands and wrists suggested a struggle. Perhaps he had tried to fend off an attacker before being mortally wounded. Cuts and defensive wounds, invisible to the naked eye, became apparent under forensic scrutiny. An analysis of his skull revealed a cranial trauma, possibly from a blow to the head, either during the attack or as he fell. The items found with him offered a glimpse into a life shaped by survival and conflict. His clothing was functional, layered for warmth against the brutal chill of the Alps. Leggings made of goat hide, a coat stitched from patches of various skins, a cloak woven from grass fibers. His shoes, stuffed with grass for insulation, were designed for arduous mountain travel. Among his possessions were a copper axe, an object of tremendous value at the time, and a well-crafted dagger of flint. His quiver contained arrows at various stages of construction, suggesting he had been in the process of restocking his weaponry. A birch bark container, likely used to carry embers for fire, starting pointed toe. A man prepared for isolation. His body was adorned with over 60 tattoos, made by puncturing the skin and rubbing in charcoal. Far from decorative, these marks clustered around joints and along the spine, leading many to believe they were a form of therapeutic acupuncture, an ancient remedy for pain. Piecing together these clues, a narrative began to emerge. A man equipped for survival, traveling alone, or perhaps fleeing danger mortally wounded by an enemy he may have seen only briefly, but who had killed Ötzi, and why one theory suggests robbery. His copper axe, a rare and precious tool, would have made him a tempting target, yet it was found beside him untouched, if robbery was the motive. The killers had been careless or in too much of a hurry to finish the deed properly. Another theory points to tribal conflict. To DNA analysis of Ötzi's blood and tissue hinted at the presence of multiple blood types on his weapons and clothing, potentially those of others wounded or killed in battle. Perhaps he had survived a skirmish only to be tracked down later. Still others suggest betrayal, an argument gone wrong. Personal vendetta settled high in the lonely mountains where no one would witness. The timeline of his death was reconstructed through painstaking analysis. His stomach contents revealed his last meals earing wheat ibex meat and fern food, suggesting he had eaten heartily not long before he died. Pollen trapped in his gut indicated that he had traveled from a lower forested valley up into the high passes shortly before his death, perhaps fleeing, perhaps on a final journey. The site where he fell told its own story, sheltered by rocks, shielded from heavy snowfall. The body's preservation was accidental but extraordinary. The conditions were just right, freezing temperatures minimal, disturbance, and the slow encasement in ice that prevented decay. Modern science continued to peel back the layers. Advanced imaging showed the extent of his atherosclerosis plaque buildup in his arteries, suggesting that despite his active life, he was at risk for heart disease. DNA sequencing revealed lactose intolerance and a genetic predisposition to Lyme disease. These findings painted a portrait not just of struggles his inherited vulnerabilities, yet it was his violent end that gripped the imagination. The arrow wound was conclusive. It entered from the back from a distance, piercing muscle and artery with deadly efficiency. It was a coward's kill or hunter's kill, a shot made from behind offering no chance for defense. There were no signs that I had been buried. He was left as he fell alone on a barren slope with the cold creeping over him like a second death. Whether his killer watched from a distance or fled immediately remains unknown. Each new study refined the story further, but never erased its essential tragedy. Ötzi was not a nameless, accidental casualty of the elements. He was a man caught up in human conflict, his final moments marked by violence and abandonment. Today he lies in a carefully controlled chamber at the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology in Bolzano, Italy, encased in ice once again. But now under the watchful gaze of science rather than the indifferent cold of the Alps, visitors peer at his shriveled form, seeing not just the wrinkles of ancient skin, but the echoes of a story 5,000 years old. A story of survival, of struggle, and of a death both sudden and cruel. In the end, Ötzi reminds us that even in the distant past, human lives were shaped by the same forces that shape us today. Fear, ambition, conflict, the fragile line between life and death. Frozen in time, he bears silent witness to a world both alien and familiar, where the mountains stood just as cold, and the blood ran just as red. Chapter 9, Vlad the Impaler's Forest of Corpses, in the blood-soaked tapestry of 15th century Eastern Europe. Few figures stand out as starkly or as chillingly as Vlad III of Wallachia, known to history as Vlad Tepes Vlad. The Impaler, he ruled a land squeezed between empires, a fragile buffer between the Christian kingdoms of the West and the relentless advance of the Muslim Ottoman Empire. His reign was forged in brutality, sharpened by betrayal, and defined by acts of terror so calculated, so ruthlessly orchestrated that they echoed across Europe like a funeral bell. Wallachia was no easy kingdom to rule, wedged between powerful neighbors. It was a realm perpetually at risk of invasion, of treachery, of collapse. Vlad, shaped by a youth spent as a hostage in Ottoman hands, and embittered by courtly betrayal, returned to claim his throne with a single savage principle: to rule through fear, and fear, he understood, was a weapon more potent than any sword. His favorite method of instilling that fear was impalement. It was not a random brutality nor the work of a mind unhinged. It was methodical, deliberate, and horrifyingly effective. Vlad's enemies were captured rebels, criminals, political opponents, and foreign invaders alike, and subjected to a death both slow and spectacular. The process was grimly systematic. Heavy, sharpened stakes were prepared, sometimes charred to harden the wood. Victims were impaled alive, the stake inserted carefully to avoid immediate death. It might be driven through the abdomen, the chest, or in the most excruciating cases, through the lower body, exiting the shoulder or mouth. The goal was not mercy, but suffering. Once hoisted upright, the victim could linger for hours, sometimes days, rising in agony under the pitiless sun. This gruesome technique was employed on a massive scale during the Great Ottoman Campaign against Waqia in 1462. Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople and the most feared ruler in the Islamic world, marched north with an army said to number in the tens of thousands, determined to crush the upstart Vivo, who dared defy Ottoman demands. Vlad could not match Mehmed in open battle. His armies were smaller, his resources strained, but he could strike at the mind, at the soul. As Mehmed's forces advanced toward Dervish Waqia's capital, they encountered a sight so ghastly that it froze their blood. Stretching across the plain before them was a forest not of trees, but of human bodies, thousands of corpses, impaled on towering stakes, swaying in the breeze like grotesque fruit. The scale defied belief. Turkish soldiers were traitors, prisoners of war, all arrayed in grim ordered rows. Some sources, such as the writings of the 15th century Saxon chroniclers who despised Vlad, claimed the forest stretched for miles and numbered 20,000 dead. Descriptions, even from biased sources, convey the scene with dreadful clarity. The stakes were varying heights, creating a kind of grotesque landscape. Some bodies were fresh blood, still dark and viscous. Others were bloated and rotting under the summer sun, filling the air with the stench of decay. Birds circled overhead, feasting on exposed flesh. From a distance, the field must have shimmered and buzzed with the constant movement of insects. It was not a battlefield after the clash. It was an offering of terror prepared in advance, designed to erode the very will of the invaders' accounts. Suggests that Mehmed, himself a seasoned warrior who had seen the worst humanity could offer, was shaken. His men, already weary and harassed by Wallachian guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run raids, poisoned wells, burned villages, found their morale shattered by the sight. Some reports say the Sultan turned back, withdrawing his forces from Waqia altogether. Others suggest he pushed onward, but with diminished fervor, ultimately forced to retreat in the face of disease, starvation, and the relentlessness of Vlad's psychological warfare. Whether Mehmed fled because of the forest of corpses or because of the broader collapse of the campaign is a matter of historical debate. Chroniclers sympathetic to Vlad painted it as a victory of terror. Ottoman sources tend to emphasize logistics and attrition, but the fact remains the forest became legend, a weapon more potent than any Waqian army could have mustered. Impalement was not merely about execution. It was spectacle. Vlad used it as a tool of governance as well. In his own territories, he employed it to enforce brutal order. Stories abound of entire villages punished for theft, whole communities reduced to lines of writhing bodies. Saxon merchants who violated Wallachian trade laws were said to have met similar fates, impaled at the borders as warnings to others. Foreign travelers carried these tales back to the courts of Europe, broadsheets, the medieval precursors too. Tabloids spread lurid stories of Vlad's atrocities, some exaggerated, some rooted in truth. In German pamphlets, he was depicted feasting among impaled victims, his goblet raised in grim toast to their suffering. In Slavic folklore, he became both monster and folk hero, a brutal guardian against foreign oppression. It was from this mixture of fact, myth, and nightmare that the figure of Dracula would eventually emerge centuries Later, Bram Stoker mining Eastern European legends found in Vlad Teyze, a model for his immortal vampire Abanus. Creature as much about power and dread as about blood, yet behind the monstrous image was a man of his time, wielding terror as a rational, calculated instrument of statecraft in the brutal calculus of 15th century politics. Where betrayal was commonplace and survival precarious, Vlad's methods horrific, though they were achieved their aims. His reign, however turbulent, left Wallachia more fiercely independent than it had been in generations. Not all reports can be taken at face value. Many sources were written by enemies, Saxons bitter over lost privileges, Hungarians wary of a volatile neighbor, Ottoman scribes eager to demonize a defiant vassal. But even discounting exaggerations, the core reality remains. Stark Vlad ruled by terror, and he wielded impalement with the precision of a master strategist. The logistics alone speak to the cold efficiency behind the horror. To impale thousands require resources, laborers too. Cut and shape stakes soldiers to capture and transport prisoners, commanders to organize the macabre display. This was no chaotic slaughter. It was a message carefully composed in blood and agony designed to be read by those who dared challenge him today in the fields of southern Romania. There is little visible trace of the horrors that once unfolded there. Grass grows where once the dead swung in silent accusation, yet the memory endures and chronicles in legend and the uneasy fascination that surrounds Vlad the Impaler. Even now, his forest of corpses stands not just as a historical event, but as a grim monument to the dark ingenuity of fear. It reminds us that power, when stripped of mercy, leaves scars, not just on the body, but on the very soul of a nation. Chapter 10. The London Beer Flood. London in 1814 was a city of smoke, sweat, and swelling crowds. The industrial revolution was tightening its grip, factories and breweries crowding the city streets with soot-stained brickwork. In the working-class neighborhood of St. Giles near Tottenham Court Road, life unfolded against a backdrop of poverty and grit. Narrow alleys twisted between crumbling houses, families packed into tiny rooms, and the air was thick with the mingling sense of cold, smoke-damp wool, and human struggle amid this maze of brick and filth rows. The towering vats of the Horseshoe Brewery, owned by Moo and Company Brewing, was big business in London. A.N. porter flows through every tavern and public house. Enormous vats, some as tall as houses, stored the beer in vast quantities. Their iron hoops strained to hold back the churning pressure within. One such vat, nearly 27 feet tall and containing over 3,500 barrels of porter around 323,000 gallons, stood ominously at the heart of the brewery. It had been constructed years earlier, its wooden staves bound tightly by heavy iron bands. Over time, the bands loosened, and the stresses grew invisible and immense. On the afternoon of October 17th, 1814, one of the iron hoops snapped. The sudden release of tension sent a thunderous crack through the building. Workers had little time to react. With an ear-splitting roar, the weakened vat gave way, entirely collapsing with the force of a cannon blast. The pressure it unleashed shattered adjacent vats, triggering a chain reaction. In an instant, hundreds of thousands of gallons of dark, heavy beer surged into the brewery like an unbridled beast. The flood burst through the brewery walls with terrifying force. Brick and timber exploded outward, showering the street with debris. A wave of porter 20 feet high by some accounts cascaded into the narrow lanes of Giles. The flood was merciless. Within seconds, it swept into the neighboring slums where families had no warning and nowhere to flee. Entire houses, rickety structures already sagging from neglect, buckled under the impact. Walls collapsed, inward floors gave way. Children, mothers, laborers, all were caught in the roaring, surging mass. Some were crushed by falling. Masonry pinned beneath the rubble before they could even scream. Others drowned where they stood, overwhelmed by the sheer volume and speed of the beer rushing through the streets and into their homes. Among the victims was a young girl named Lelanina Cooper, just 8 years old, who had been taking tea with her mother. When the flood tore through their residence, others perished while gathered in basements or sitting rooms trapped as the torrent filled. Cellars and lower floors with terrifying speed. Contemporary accounts describe the chaos. People scrambling at top tables and furniture in desperate attempts to stay above the rising flood neighbors, forming human chains to pull the stranded to safety, the deafening crash of collapsing buildings mingling. With the shouts of rescuers and the cries of the wounded, the Horseshoe Brewery itself was left in ruins, its walls gutted its iron. Vats twisted and broken like discarded toys, the air wire of beer and dust, and the streets were left soaked in a sticky, pungent deluge. The death toll was grim. 8 people were officially recorded as killed, though some accounts suggest there may have been more among the densely packed, impoverished population of St. Giles. Bodies were pulled from the wreckage, for days their clothes soaked and stained. As the immediate floodwaters receded, the grim work of recovery began. The beer, now mingled with mud and blood, left a rancid film over everything it touched. Volunteers and laborers dug through rubble, searching for survivors, or more often for the dead. Makeshift shelters were set up for the newly homeless, but resources were thin. Many of the survivors, already living on the edge of subsistence, had lost everything. In the days that followed, Londoners responded in the only way they knew, with a mixture of solemn mourning and grim, sometimes macabre humor. Newspapers reported on the beer flood, with a tone that fluctuated between tragic and sardonic tales. Spread of people scooping beer from the gutters into pots and pans of fights breaking out over salvageable casks. Whether these stories were exaggerated or true hardly mattered. The legend of the London beer flood was born. The coroner's inquest into the disaster concluded that the deaths were accidental, an act of God. No one was held criminally responsible. Mose and Company successfully petitioned Parliament for an excise tax rebate on the lost porter, a financial relief that allowed the brewery to survive the catastrophe. In a bitter twist, the company suffered no lasting damage to its reputation, and some even viewed the brewery sympathetically as another victim of the freak event. For the families of the dead, however, there was little solace. They buried their loved ones in crowded churchyards, far from the grand cemeteries reserved for London's wealthy. The flood was quickly absorbed into the city's collective memory. Another strange chapter in its long, chaotic history. In the years that followed, brewing regulations changed little vats continued to tower over London, although engineers grew more cautious with their designs. Over time, the Horseshoe Brewery rebuilt its battered shell, repaired the tragedy, fading into a footnote as the city pressed relentlessly forward. Today, little remains of the London beer flood, but faded newspaper clippings and the occasional memorial mention. Yet for those brief, terrible moments on an autumn afternoon, the streets of St. Giles ran thick with porter, and in the aftermath, a city that prided itself on order and resilience was reminded once again how thin the line was between the ordinary and the unimaginable. Chapter 11, Japan's Unit 731. During the long, brutal stretch of the Second World War, beneath the surface of the major battles that raged across continents, dark occurrence ran. Hidden operations, secret atrocities, crimes against humanity committed far from the scrutiny of the world. Among the most chilling of these was Unit 731, the covert biological and chemical warfare research division of the Imperial Japanese Army. It was headquartered in occupied Minoria near the city of Harbin. Officially operated under the name Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department, a benign title that concealed the horrifying nature of its work. It was commanded by Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, a man whose ambition for scientific recognition and military supremacy would leave behind a legacy stained with unimaginable cruelty. In the sprawling complex of Unit 731, surrounded by high walls and barbed wire, thousands of prisoners, mostly Chinese, Civilians, but also Koreans, Mongolians, Russians, and the few allied prisoners of war, became unwilling subjects in a systematic program of human experimentation. One of the most infamous practices was vivisection, live dissection of human beings without anesthesia, the subjects referred to by researchers only as logs to dehumanize them were cut open. While still alive to study the progression of diseases and internal injuries, organs were removed while hearts still beat. Infected tissues were observed as illness ravaged the body in real time. No sedatives were given. Anesthetics, it was argued, would interfere with pure results. Prisoners were deliberately infected with deadly pathogens, plague, anthrax, cholera, typhoid, through injections, contaminated food, or exposure to aerosolized germs. Once infected, they were left untreated, monitored closely as symptoms developed. Some were exposed to biological weapons and open-air tests, tied to stakes in remote fields as plague-infested bombs exploded around them. Other experiments sought to test the limits of human endurance. Subjects were exposed to extreme temperatures to study frostbite. A pressing issue for Japanese forces operating in cold climates, victims' limbs were frozen solid with ice water or wind until the flesh crackled. Researchers then experimented with various methods of thawing, often amputating the frozen limbs to examine the damage. Pressure chambers crushed prisoners to death as scientists studied the effects of rapid decompression. Others were subjected to lethal doses of radiation, starvation, dehydration, and forced abortions. Pregnant women were infected to observe how diseases transmitted from mother to fetus. The work was systematic, meticulously recorded, and cloaked in total secrecy. Those who worked within Unit 731 scientists, doctor soldiers, were sworn to silence under threat of death. To the outside world, the facility was simply part of Japan's wartime infrastructure. Unit 731's mission was twofold: to develop biological weapons for use against enemy populations and to understand the limits of human survival for military advantage. Plague bombs, ceramic shells filled with fleas carrying Yersinia pestis were developed and deployed in China, causing outbreaks that killed tens of thousands. Wells were poisoned, food supplies contaminated, civilian populations exposed without warning as the tide of war turned against Japan. The urgency inside Unit 731 grew. Plans were drawn up for biological attacks against allied cities, including San Diego, though they were ultimately abandoned when Japan surrendered when the Soviet Union invaded Minoria in August 1945. Unit 731 began a frantic effort to destroy evidence. Documents were burned, facilities dynamited, and surviving prisoners were executed. Shiro Ishii ordered the final dissolution of the unit, and its personnel scattered or went into hiding. Yet the atrocities of Unit 731 did not remain buried forever. After the war, fragments of testimony began to emerge. Former workers spoke in guarded terms about what had happened. Soviet trials of captured Japanese officials in Khabarovsk in 1949 brought some details to light. Although in the West coverage was sparse, muffled by geopolitical tensions in the United States, intelligence officials learned of the extensive data gathered by Unit 731, data on biological warfare and human endurance that had no parallel in Allied research. Rather than prosecute those responsible, the U.S. quietly struck a deal in exchange for exclusive access to the research figures like Shiro Ishii, and his senior staff were granted immunity from war crimes prosecution. The findings were funneled into American biological warfare programs. The deal was shrouded in secrecy, hidden from the public for decades. It remains one of the darker compromises made during the early years of the Cold War, when strategic advantage often trumped moral accountability. In Japan, Unit 731 slipped into the shadows of history. Many former members reintegrated into society, some rising to prominent positions in medicine, academia, and business. For years, the Japanese government officially denied the existence of the unit in public. Acknowledgement came only slowly through the persistent efforts of historians, journalists, and a few courageous survivors. The legacy of Unit 731 haunts discussions of medical ethics even today. It serves as a stark warning of how easily scientific ambition unmoored from humanity and oversight can descend into atrocity. It underscores the necessity of informed consent, of human rights, of clear ethical lines that must never be crossed. In recent years, memorials and museums in China have preserved the memory of Unit 731's victims. Ruins of the original complex near Harbin remain a grim testament to the horrors that unfolded. Behind its walls, the story of Unit 731 is not one of isolated madness or rogue cruelty. It is the story of a system meticulously organized and justified in the name of national interest. It is a reminder that atrocities are rarely the work of monsters alone. They are carried out by ordinary people, scientists, and soldiers when systems permit or encourage the abandonment of basic human dignity. The silence that once surrounded Unit 731 has cracked, but the full measure of its horrors can never truly be undone. Thousands suffered and died in the name of progress and conquest, their pain meticulously recorded in notebooks now gathering dust in archives. In remembering them and in confronting the uncomfortable truths about how and why such atrocities occur, we are forced to reckon not only with history, but with ourselves and the choices that shape the future. Chapter 12, Herodotus' report of his Scythian skin trophies. In the vast windswept steppes north of the Black Sea were endless grasslands blurred into the horizon, and the sky seemed impossibly wide. The Scythians roamed. They were a nomadic people, fierce and self-reliant, living from horseback hunting, raiding, and wearing across an untamed frontier to the settled civilizations of Greece and Persia. The Scythians appeared almost mythic, wild, elusive, and brutally skilled in the art of war. Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian, often called the father of history, wrote about them in his great work, the histories recording what he had learned from travelers, traders, and perhaps second-hand witnesses. His descriptions, vivid and at times shocking, painted the Scythians as a people bound to the harsh realities of survival and to a warrior code that revered strength and despised weakness. Among the most chilling customs he described was their treatment of enemies slain in battle. According to Herodotus, the Scythians did not merely defeat their foes. They took their bodies as raw material for trophies, crafting cloaks, quivers, belts, and even drinking vessels from human skin. Herodotus claimed that after battle, Scythian warriors would strip the skin from the corpses of their enemies with a deliberate and practiced skill. The method he described was gruesome, a careful incision made around the head peeling the skin downward, much as one might strip the hide from an animal. These skins were then tanned, processed, until they were supple enough to be sewn or fashioned into usable items. A warrior of reputation might wear a cloak stitched together from the skins of many enemies, each patch a grim testament to a life taken. Others reportedly decorated their horse harnesses, saddlebags, or even clothing with these macabre trophies. Skins were sometimes displayed outside the warrior's tent, fluttering like banners in the ceaseless wind, a warning to rivals and a badge of personal glory. According to Herodotus, the Scythians did not stop at skins alone. The skulls of defeated enemies, he wrote, were cleaned, hollowed, and sometimes lined with gold to be used as drinking cups. If the slain opponent had been particularly esteemed or formidable, the victor might drink from the skull as a gesture of triumph and remembrance. Such acts were not performed out of mindless cruelty, but as expressions of respect for strength and a deep, if brutal, recognition of life's impermanence. The Scythians believed that by incorporating parts of their enemies into their daily lives, they absorbed some measure of their strength and spirit. It was a warrior culture at its most raw, a society where survival was won through dominance and where physical reminders of victory served as personal trophies and public statements. Yet, even as Herodotus chronicled these practices, he acknowledged the distance between his Greek worldview and the Scythian ethos. What seemed barbaric to the Greeks was for the Scythians a deeply ingrained part of their identity. They lived in a land without cities, without stone monuments, without written records, a place where memory was preserved not through books, but through deeds. Modern scholars debate the absolute accuracy of Herodotus's accounts. Some suggest he may have exaggerated, relying on secondhand stories colored by fear and fascination. Others point out that archaeological evidence, including Scythian burial mounds, known as Curians, has uncovered signs of elaborate weaponry, intricate horse gear, and artistic traditions that support the idea of a warrior society deeply preoccupied with death and status. Within these burial mounds, richly adorned with gold ornaments and finely crafted weapons, bodies of Scythian nobles have been found alongside their horses, sacrificed to accompany their masters into the afterlife. Tattoos preserved on frozen Scythian mummies hint at a culture steeped in symbolism and ritual. These glimpses into Scythian life suggest that the acts Herodotus described, however brutal they seem to modern sensibilities, fit into a broader worldview where death, honor, and remembrance were closely intertwined. The Scythians were not without spirituality. They worshipped a pantheon of gods, chief among them a female deity associated with the earth, and a war god who demanded sacrifice. Ritual killings, including the reported flaying of enemies, may have been offerings meant to appease these powers to ensure success in battle and prosperity for the tribe. Their entire way of life was shaped by movement and conflict. Without permanent cities, their wealth traveled with them in their horses, their arms, and their memories. Trophies fashioned from the dead served as a mobile record of personal and communal history, each skin or skull telling a story understood by all who saw it. Herodotus' vivid storytelling captured the imaginations of his readers and has left an indelible image of the Scythians in history. Whether every detail he reported was strictly factual or tinged with the exaggerations common to travelers' tales, the core truth remains. The Scythians lived and died by the sword, and they honored their victories in ways both practical and terrifying. Their culture faded over centuries as new powers rose across the steppes. Yet in their time, they were a force to be reckoned with, horse archers, swift and deadly fierce custodians of a way of life that valued courage above all else. Through Herodotus' words, the image of the Scythian warrior endures, a figure clad not only in furs and leathers, but perhaps in a patchwork cloak sewn from the vanquished, riding across the endless grasslands beneath an endless sky, a living monument to the brutal truths of his world. Subscribe to the channel if you want more informative and sleeping stories. Thank you.